In the winter of 1739, a small bronze object was carried into a candlelit room in London and placed on a polished table before some of the most learned men in England, and not one of them could say what it was. It had been pulled from the earth of a field in Hertfordshire, north of the city, along with a few old coins that told everyone roughly when it had been buried. The coins were Roman. The object, therefore, was presumed to be Roman as well. It was about the size of an orange. It was hollow. It had 12 flat faces, each face a perfect 5-sided figure, and in the centre of each face there was a round hole, and no two holes were quite the same size. At every corner where 3 faces met, there sat a small round knob of bronze, like a little bead. 20 of them in all. The gentlemen of the Society of Antiquaries passed it from hand to hand. They held it up to the candle flame. They looked through the holes, one eye closed, the way you might look through a keyhole into a locked room. And then they did the only honest thing that anyone has ever been able to do with this object. They admitted they did not know. Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight I want to tell you the story of that object, and of the more than 100 others like it that have come out of the ground since, because nearly 300 years have passed since that candlelit evening in London. And here is the thing I find gently astonishing, the thing I keep turning over as I fall asleep myself. We still do not know. We have sent probes past the edge of the solar system. We have read the genomes of people who died 40,000 years ago. We can tell you what a Roman soldier ate for breakfast on a Tuesday in the year 100 from the residue in a cooking pot. And this little bronze thing, made by ordinary Roman hands somewhere in the northern provinces of the empire, still sits in its museum cases. In London and Paris and Bonn and a dozen quieter towns, keeping its secret perfectly. The Romans, you see, wrote everything down. That is what makes this silence so strange. They wrote tax receipts and love letters and complaints about the beer. They wrote instruction manuals for building aqueducts and treatises on how to fatten dormice for dinner parties. An empire of lists and ledgers and inscriptions. An empire that carved its business onto stone so the centuries could read it. And in all of that writing, all of it, every scroll and tablet and tombstone that has survived from 1,000 years of Roman civilization, there is not one sentence, not one word, that mentions this object. No one wrote down its name. No one wrote down its price. No one wrote down what it was for. More than 100 of them, cast in expensive bronze by skilled craftsmen across 3 centuries, and the written record of the most bureaucratic empire in the ancient world simply looks the other way. So tonight we are going to sit with that silence, you and I, and we are going to walk through it slowly. There is no need to solve anything. Cleverer people than us have tried for 3 centuries, and the object has outlasted every one of their theories, and I suspect it will outlast ours too. That is not a failure. That is, I think, the gift of the thing. A mystery with no violence in it, no curse, no disaster. Just a shape and a question, and the long quiet of time. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, the dodecahedron will not mind. It has been waiting 1,700 years. It is very good at waiting. Let me tell you first what the word means, because it is a mouthful, and then I promise we will let the mathematics rest. A dodecahedron is simply a solid shape with 12 faces. The ancient Greeks, who loved perfect forms above almost everything, knew that if you wanted every face to be identical, every edge the same length, every angle the same, there were only 5 solid shapes in the entire universe that could do it. 5, and no more, no matter how long you searched. The cube is one of them, with its 6 square faces. The pyramid with 4 triangular sides is another, and the most elusive of the 5, the one that seemed to the Greek mind almost too perfect to exist, was the dodecahedron, 12 5-sided faces folded together into a ball that is not quite a ball. Plato himself, writing 4 centuries before the Roman objects were made, gave each of the 5 perfect solids a meaning. Fire was the sharp little pyramid. Earth was the steady cube. Air and water had their shapes too. And when he came to the dodecahedron, the fifth shape, the leftover shape, he wrote something remarkable. He said the god had used it for the whole, for the heavens, for the universe itself. Keep that in your pocket as we go, because it will matter later, in the deep part of the night, when we come to the strangest of all the theories. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let us go back to the beginning, to the field in Hertfordshire, and let us do what the men in that candlelit room could not do, which is to follow the object backward, out of the candlelight, down into the soil, and back across 17 centuries to the hands that made it. Here is what that first find looked like, as best we can reconstruct it. A labourer or a farmer, turning the earth in the parish of Aston, strikes something hard, not a stone. Stones do not ring under the spade. He kneels and works it loose and rubs the mud away with his thumb, and finds himself holding a small cage of green-crusted metal, lighter than it looks, because it is hollow. Bronze goes green in the ground, a soft powdery green like the bloom on a plum, and the object would have looked less like treasure and more like something grown, a seed pod from a tree that does not exist. Nearby, in the same dark soil, a scatter of coins, silvered and worn, with the faces of dead emperors on them. The coins, he understands. Coins are money, and money is money even when it is 1700 years old. But the little cage of bronze is something else. It has no value he can name, and yet it is obviously made, obviously careful, obviously the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And so it travels, as curiosities did in those days, upward through the ranks of English society, from the finder to the landowner, from the landowner to a gentleman collector, until in 1739 it arrives on that table in London, at the Society of Antiquaries, where men in powdered wigs lean over it with candles and cannot name it either. The Society kept minutes, and the minutes record the moment, which is why we know about it at all. A piece of mixed metal, they wrote, of ancient brass, consisting of 12 equal sides. They noted the holes. They noted the little knobs at the corners. And then the entry simply ends, as entries do when there is nothing more to say. No conclusion, no theory, just a description, and beneath the description, unwritten but unmistakable, a shrug that has now lasted nearly 3 centuries. I love that shrug, I have to tell you. There is something wonderfully honest about it. Because the men of the Society of Antiquaries were not fools. They were the kind of men who could read Latin at breakfast and Greek at lunch, who had catalogued the coins of every emperor and could date a fragment of Samian pottery by its gloss. They lived and breathed the Roman world, and when the Roman world handed them this one small object, they had nothing. If it had been an unusual kind of oil lamp, they would have known. If it had been a weight or a toy or a piece of horse harness or a doctor's instrument, they would have known. Because the Romans left thousands of all of those things, and they left them everywhere. And they wrote about them. This was different. This had no family. It sat on the table that evening in London like a single word from a language nobody spoke. And here is where our story properly begins, because that object from Aston was not the last. Over the next 300 years, as Europe dug canals and railway cuttings and cellars and vineyards, as archaeology slowly became a science instead of a treasure hunt, the earth kept handing them up, one from a riverbed, one from a grave, one from the ruins of a burned house, one from a hoard of coins buried in a moment of panic when the frontier was falling. By the time anyone thought to count, there were dozens. Today the count stands at somewhere around 130, depending on who is counting and how strict they are about fragments. 130 small bronze cages, no 2 of them identical, scattered across the ground of what was once the Roman northwest. And the map of where they were found, when you finally pin all the little flags into it, turns out to be one of the most telling clues in the whole mystery, because of where the flags cluster, and even more because of where there are no flags at all. But before we look at the map, I want you to hold the object itself for a moment, as the antiquaries did. Feel the weight of it, or rather the lack of weight, the hollowness that always surprises people. Turn it under the light. Notice the little circles engraved around some of the holes, rings within rings, cut with a compass by a steady hand. Notice that the holes really are all different sizes, that this is not sloppiness but choice, because the circles engraved around them are perfect. Whoever made this could have made every hole identical. They chose not to. 12 faces, 12 holes, a dozen different diameters, and 20 little knobs standing up at the corners, like the heads of nails that fasten the thing to nothing at all. It fits in your palm, it asks nothing of you. And after 1700 years, it is still, patiently, waiting for someone to say its name. So let us look at the map together, slowly, because maps are calming things when there is no journey you actually have to make. Picture Europe from above, on a clear night, the entire continent laid out beneath you like a dark quilt. Now let us light a small lamp at every place where one of these objects has come out of the ground. A lamp in southern Britain, near that field in Hertfordshire. More lamps across England and Wales, up through the middle counties, along the old roads, past the sites of forgotten forts, until the last few flicker on near Hadrian's Wall, at the cold northern edge of what Rome ever managed to hold. Perhaps 36 lamps in Britain alone, more than in any other single land. Now carry your eye across the water. Lamps come on all over northern France, the country the Romans called Gaul. They cluster along the great rivers, because rivers were the highways of that world. More lamps in Belgium, in Luxembourg, in Switzerland. A whole constellation of them along the Rhine, at the fortress towns the empire built to watch the far bank. Places whose Roman names have softened into Bonn and Mainz and Cologne. A few more follow the Danube east, through Austria, one as far as Hungary. And there, rather suddenly, the lamps stop. Now notice what you are looking at, because this is the crooked part, the part that has puzzled every scholar who has ever pinned this map. The entire southern half of the quilt is dark. Italy is dark. Rome itself, the city of 1 million people, the centre of the entire world, has never produced a single one. Spain is dark. The south of France is dark. Greece is dark. Egypt and North Africa and the rich, crowded, literate eastern half of the empire, the half with the oldest cities and the busiest workshops, dark, dark, dark. Whatever these objects were, they belonged to the north. Not to the empire as a whole, but to one cool green corner of it. The corner of mists and river fogs. The corner the Mediterranean Romans thought of as the edge of the earth. They belonged to the lands of the Gauls and the Britons and the peoples of the Rhine. Lands that had their own gods and their own languages long before the legions came, and that kept a good deal of both, quietly, underneath the toga and the Latin. Hold that thought too, because it is not an accident, and we will come back to it. Now, when did they belong? Objects out of the ground can be dated roughly by what they are found with, and the answer here is fairly steady. The 2nd century after Christ, the 3rd century into the 4th. Call it a span of 200 years or so, maybe a little more. Beginning in the long calm afternoon of the empire, the age when the frontier still held firm, and running into the anxious years when it began to crack. That is a long life for a fashion. Whatever this thing was, it was not a passing novelty. Grandfathers and grandsons, whole generations of people in Gaul and Britain, went on wanting these objects, paying for these objects, for as long as Victorian Britain lasted, longer than the United States has existed. Something that endures like that is not a whim. It answers some need, practical or otherwise, that stayed steady for 200 years. And where exactly do they turn up when the trowel finds them? This matters enormously in archaeology, because an object's resting place is a kind of last sentence about its life, and the resting places of the dodecahedra are wonderfully varied and wonderfully unexpected. Some come from the ruins of ordinary houses, from the layers of ash and collapse where a settlement burned or simply fell down over time, as if the thing had been on a shelf among the household goods when the roof came in. Some come from military places, from the ditches and rubbish pits of forts along the Rhine and the Wall, which made generations of scholars wonder if it was army equipment, some piece of a soldier's kit. And we will weigh that idea properly later in the night. Some come from rivers, which sounds like carelessness, a thing dropped from a bridge, until you learn that the peoples of the Roman North had been giving precious things to rivers for 1,000 years, swords and cauldrons and coins, gifts to the water. And then you start to wonder whether anything found in a river is ever really lost. At least one was found in a theatre. A few come from graves, and I will tell you about one of those graves in the deep part of tonight's story, because it is, for my money, the single most haunting piece of evidence in the whole affair. And a number of them, a striking number, come from hoards. Let me explain what a hoard is, because the word gets used loosely. A hoard is not lost property. A hoard is deliberate. It is what happens when a person gathers up the most valuable portable things they own, puts them in a pot or a bag or a box, digs a hole, usually at night, usually in a place only they would think of, and buries everything, intending to come back. People bury hoards when the world stops feeling safe, when there are raiders on the road, when the garrison has marched away, when the rumours from the frontier have stopped being rumours. And the fact that they are still in the ground when we find them means, of course, that the person never came back. Every hoard is a small, unfinished story. Now, in the town of Krefeld in Germany, near the site of a Roman fort on the Rhine, such a hoard came to light, and in among the coins, hundreds of them, silver and bronze, the accumulated cash of somebody's whole life, there was a dodecahedron. Think about what that means. It does not tell us what the object was for. But it tells us what it was worth, at least to one frightened person on one dangerous night 17 centuries ago, when they had a few minutes, perhaps only a few minutes, to decide what from their entire life was worth carrying into the dark and burying. They chose the money. And they chose this. Not the furniture, not the tools, not the good cloak. The coins, and the little bronze cage with 12 holes. Whatever it was not junk. Whatever it was, you saved it. There is one more feature of the map I want to show you before we move on, and it is my favourite, because it is the kind of detail that turns a scattering of dots into something almost like a message. In all the lands where the lamps are lit, across Britain and Gaul and the German frontier, the objects are made of bronze, a metal of real value, the metal of coins and statues and military fittings. Bronze could always be melted down and turned into something else, which is why so much Roman metalwork has vanished, recycled a dozen times over the centuries. For over 100 of these objects to survive, many more must once have existed. Hundreds more, perhaps thousands, an entire vanished population of them, of which our 130 are only the lucky rearguard. The ones that happened to be in the ground, in graves and rivers and forgotten hoards, when the ancient world ended. And yet, for all those numbers, no two of them are the same. Listen to how odd that is. They are unmistakably the same kind of thing. You could never confuse one with anything else. Set all 130 on one long table, and any child would tell you they belong together, just as a child knows that a Chihuahua and a Wolfhound are both dogs. But measure them, and the family resemblance dissolves into endless small differences. The smallest are the size of a walnut, small enough to close your fist around. The largest is the size of a grapefruit. Some are plain. Some are engraved with fine concentric circles. Some have little dots and grooves. The knobs at the corners vary in shape and size. And the holes, those 12 round openings that stare out of every face, follow no standard at all, not from object to object, and not even within a single object, where each face may have its own diameter, arranged in no pattern anyone has ever been able to agree on. Nothing else in the Roman world works like that. And that is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is easy to miss how deeply unlike Rome this is. Rome was the great standardizer of the ancient world. Roman measuring cups hold standard measures, Roman army gear is so uniform that a buckle from Scotland can be matched to a buckle from Syria. Roman bricks are stamped. Roman amphorae, the big clay shipping jars, are so consistent that scholars date shipwrecks by their curves. When Rome made a class of practical object, Rome made it to spec, because the whole point of a tool is that it works the same way in every hand. The dodecahedra ignore all of that. They are a category with no standard, a species where every specimen is a variation, as if what mattered was not the measurements at all, but the idea, the shape itself, 12 faces, 20 knobs, holes to look through, and beyond that, every workshop, perhaps every customer, was free to dream. Tools do not usually behave that way. Symbols do. But I am getting ahead of myself again, and the night is still young. Before we can weigh any theory, we should do what any patient investigator does with an unknown object. We should ask how it was made and what it cost, because the making of a thing is a language of its own, and in this case the making turns out to be the first real surprise of the story. It turns out these were not simple things to produce. Not at all. To understand that, I want to take you out of the museum case entirely, back across 1700 years, to a workshop in a Roman town on the Moselle River, on an autumn morning that history never recorded, but that must, in some form, have happened many hundreds of times. Come with me. The fire is already lit. The town is Augusta Treverorum, which the centuries will wear down to Trier, and in this period it is one of the great cities of the Roman north, a place of bridges and warehouses and bathhouses on the banks of the Moselle. In a side street behind the Potter's Quarter, a bronzesmith is beginning his day. Let us call him Verecundus, which was a real and common name in Roman Gaul, a good workshop name. And let us be honest with each other that he is our invention, a lamp we are lighting so we can see the process, because some man very like him truly did this work, in this town, and left us his fingerprints in the metal, if not his name. Verecundus is a broad-shouldered man in middle age, olive-skinned, his black hair going grey at the temples, his beard cropped close because beards and furnaces are a poor mix. He wears a plain woolen tunic under a scarred leather apron, and his forearms carry the small pale burn scars that are the service record of his trade. This morning there is an order to fill. Someone, and oh, what we would give to know who, has asked him for a dodecahedron. Now here is the first thing to understand. Verecundus cannot simply hammer this object out of a sheet of bronze, and he cannot carve it, and he cannot build it up out of soldered plates, or rather he could, but that is not how these things were done. Nearly all the dodecahedra that survive were cast, made in one single pour of liquid metal, hollow, with all 12 faces and all 20 knobs formed in the same moment. And casting a hollow 12-sided cage in one pour is, if you will permit me, a small anachronism, a genuinely advanced piece of manufacturing. The method is called lost wax casting, and it is one of the oldest and most beautiful tricks in the history of human hands, and it works like this. You begin not with metal, but with wax. Beeswax, warmed until it works like stiff dough. Verecundus takes a core of clay, roughly ball-shaped, and around this core he builds the object in wax. Exactly as it will finally appear, every face, every edge, every one of the 20 little knobs modelled in soft yellow wax. This is where all the skill lives. The pentagon is not a forgiving shape. 12 of them must meet around the clay core with every angle agreeing, or the whole form goes lopsided, and you can tell from the finished objects that these makers used compasses and scribing tools, because the circles around the holes are perfect, and the faces are true. The wax model takes him most of a day. Then comes the burial. The finished wax model, with its clay heart, is coated in layer after layer of fine wet clay, painted on at first so it catches every detail, then packed on thicker and thicker until the delicate thing has vanished inside a solid lump, with a few channels of wax left running to the outside like drinking straws. The lump goes gently into the embers to dry, and then the fire is built up, and now comes the moment the whole method is named for. The wax melts, it streams out through the channels and is gone, lost, and where the model used to be there is now a model-shaped nothing, a dodecahedron of empty space sealed inside baked clay, with the clay core still hanging in the middle of the void, held in place by little pins of bronze. The mould is heated glowing hot. The furnace, fed with charcoal and driven by bellows, brings the crucible of bronze up past 1,000 degrees, to the temperature where the metal glows like a sunrise and pours like cream. And then, in the one moment of the whole week that cannot be taken back, Verecundus lifts the crucible with long tongs and pours the liquid sun into the mould, and the metal runs down the channels and floods the emptiness, filling in one rush every face, every edge, every knob, drinking up the exact shape of the vanished wax. There is steam and a smell of scorched earth, and then there is nothing to do but wait. If he is misjudged, if the metal was too cool or the mould too damp or the channels too narrow, the pour will be incomplete, and days of work are ruined, and we know this happens sometimes, because failed and flawed castings of other objects turn up in workshop rubbish all over the empire. But say the day goes well. The mould cools from red to grey to merely warm, and then Verecundus takes a mallet and breaks it, cracks the clay away like a man shelling a walnut. And there, dark with fire scale, is the thing itself. Metal where wax was. He saws off the channels, now solid bronze rods, and drills or files clean the 12 holes, and inside it, listen to this, inside it, the clay core is still there, and it can never come out whole, because the holes are smaller than the core. So he breaks it up with a slender iron pick, patiently through the holes, and shakes the crumbs out a pinch at a time, turning the object over and over, the world's least restful rattle, until at last the cage is empty and light. Then the finishing, files and abrasive stone and cloth, hours of it, until the fire scale is gone and the object shows the warm honey gold of fresh bronze, nothing like the green we know, because the green is time's paint, not the maker's. He engraves the fine concentric circles around the holes with a compass cutter, 2 rings here, 3 rings there, and polishes the 20 knobs bright. And now stop and stand with me at his bench, because this is the moment I have brought you here to see. The object is finished. It has taken a skilled man the better part of a week. The bronze alone, several 100 grams of good copper, alloyed with tin, is worth real money, weeks of wages for a labourer, and the labour on top of that. This is not a trinket. In the price list of the Roman world, this thing sits somewhere near a fine brooch or a decent sword fitting, a purchase you would think about, save for, justify to your household. Somebody walked into that workshop and wanted this badly enough to pay for it. And here is the question that should keep us all pleasantly awake for another minute or two. When the customer came to collect it, what did they check? Every purchase has its inspection. You sight down a sword blade. You test a brooch pin. You weigh a measuring cup, because you are paying for the standard. What did the buyer of a dodecahedron do, there at the bench, to satisfy themselves it was right? Did they measure the holes? We can almost rule that out, and this to me is the most eloquent single fact in the entire mystery. Because whatever the buyer checked, it was not the diameters. The holes vary from object to object, face to face, with no repeating standard anyone has found. And yet the geometry is careful, and the engraving is careful, which tells us something true and surprising about the mind behind the order. Precision mattered to these people. Measurement apparently did not. They wanted it perfect, but they did not need it calibrated. Sit with that. Every tool theory we weigh tonight will have to climb over it, and you should feel free to fall asleep before any of them makes it. And there is one further thing to notice in that workshop before we leave it. Something easy to walk past, which is the knowledge itself. Where did Verecundus learn to do this? Not the casting. Casting was the common tongue of every bronze shop in the empire, but the layout, the geometry, the trick of making 12 5-sided faces close perfectly around a hollow. You cannot eyeball a pentagon. Its angles do not divide the circle by any of the easy fractions a workman's dividers find on their own, and getting 12 of them to agree in 3 dimensions is a puzzle that has defeated many a modern craftsman attempting a replica with modern tools on the first try and the second. Somewhere behind every one of our 130 objects there is a method, a sequence of compass strokes on a slate or a wax tablet, a rule of thumb passed from a master's hands to an apprentice's. Do it this way, then this way, and it closes. And that method was itself a possession, as real as the crucible, and it was handed down as everything in an ancient workshop was handed down, by standing next to somebody for 10 years, and it was written on exactly nothing. The trades of the ancient world published no manuals. What survived in fingers. So notice what that means for our mystery, because it quietly doubles it. It is not only the purpose of the dodecahedron that travelled mouth to mouth and hand to hand until the last mouth closed, it is the making too. Across 3 centuries and half a dozen provinces, in workshops that can never have all known each other, the same intricate, counterintuitive, teachable method kept producing the same impossible little cage, which tells you there was a living chain of instruction, master to apprentice's apprentice, faithfully carrying not just a skill, but a design, this design specifically, among all the objects they could have been making with that skill. Something kept that chain unbroken for 200 years. Habit does not do that. Fashion does not do that. Fashion cannot hold its breath for 2 centuries. Things that keep chains unbroken across generations are things with weight in them: duty, belief, identity, the sense that this is simply what our craft owes the world. And though I cannot show you the weight, I can show you its shadow, 130 times over in museum cases from Britain to Hungary. One more grain of evidence from the workshop before we move on. A small one, but in a mystery this quiet, even the small grains shine. In 1868, workers at Arloff in Germany turned up an object that was catalogued, sensibly enough, as another dodecahedron and put away in a museum drawer. Generations later, somebody actually counted its faces. There were 20. 20 triangular faces, not 12 5-sided ones. It is an icosahedron, the dodecahedron's sister among Plato's 5 perfect solids, the only one of its kind ever found, and it had sat mislabelled for the better part of a century, because no one expected there to be a second impossible shape. So the family is larger than we thought. Somewhere in the Roman north, at least one workshop, at least once, was asked to render a different one of the 5 perfect solids in bronze, with the same knobs, the same craft, the same silence in the written record. Whatever tradition produced these objects, it knew its geometry, the full set of it, the Greek philosopher's set. Remember Plato's 5 shapes, fire and earth and air and water, and the 5th, the 12-sided one, the shape of the heavens entire. Out here on the misty edge of the empire, 700 years after Plato, somebody was casting the heavens in bronze, one careful pour at a time, and never writing down why. And with the object warm from the polishing cloth in our imaginations, we should follow it now out of the workshop and into its long sleep, because the next part of the story belongs not to the maker, but to the finders. And one finding in particular, in our own century, in a quiet English field, where a group of amateurs with a rented digger and a week of good weather were about to have the best morning of their lives. The field is in Lincolnshire, in the flat green east of England, near a village with the improbable name of Norton Disney, and yes, before you ask, it is that Disney. The family that would one day produce Walt took their name from this parish, or rather brought it here from Normandy centuries ago, Disney being the worn-down form of a French place name, and the village keeps the connection with a certain quiet English amusement. But that is a story for another night. Our story is about what lies under the fields just outside the village, which is the buried skeleton of a Roman settlement, a villa estate that prospered here when Lincolnshire was the province of Britannia, and about the local people who decided in our own time to go looking for it. They were not a university expedition. They were a village archaeology group, the kind of society that meets in the church hall. Retired engineers and farmers and schoolteachers and teenagers doing it for the love of the thing, with professional archaeologists guiding the work. Each summer they would open a few careful trenches, and each summer the field would give them the ordinary wonderful litter of Roman life, potsherds and coins, animal bone and oyster shells, the small change of 4 centuries. And then came the morning in the early summer of 2023. It was the second to last day of that year's dig. One of the volunteers was working down through the dark fill of an old pit, a quarry hollow that Romans had later used for burying things, and his trowel found metal. What he lifted out, whole and unbroken, into the Lincolnshire daylight, after 1700 years of darkness, was a dodecahedron. There is video from that morning, and I recommend it to you as a small document of pure human joy. Word goes across the trenches and the whole dig gathers, mud-kneed, sun-hatted, crowding in like family around a new baby. The object passes from glove to glove. Someone laughs in disbelief. Someone else goes very quiet. One of the group's organisers, asked about it later by every newspaper and radio programme in Britain, kept saying versions of the same thing. Of all the things we dreamed of finding, this was the top of the list, and none of us actually believed it would ever be us. And this particular find mattered, scientifically, not just emotionally, for several reasons. First, its condition. Most dodecahedra in the museum cases of Europe were found a century or two ago, before archaeology grew careful, and they arrived stripped of their stories, no one having recorded exactly where they lay or what lay around them. This one came out of an undisturbed context, recorded to the centimetre, photographed in place. Its layer dated by the pottery packed around it to the 4th century after Christ. Second, its quality. It is one of the largest ever found, the size of a big grapefruit, and it is complete, undamaged, beautifully made. And third, most tellingly, its situation. It was not in a house floor. It was not in a workshop. It was not lost on a road. It had been placed deliberately in that pit, in ground that held no rubbish of the everyday kind, and the pit filled in over it. The archaeologists supervising the dig chose their words carefully, as archaeologists do, but the words they chose were words like deliberate, and placed, and possibly ritual. Nobody drops a grapefruit-sized lump of precious bronze into a hole by accident. Somebody in 4th century Lincolnshire put it there, on purpose, and walked away, and never came back for it, and the strong suspicion is that walking away was the whole point. That it was not storage, but surrender. A gift to the ground. We will come back to what that might mean in the deep part of the night. But first, since this specimen is so fresh and so well recorded, let us use it as the specialists did, as a chance to interrogate the object with modern eyes. It was scanned, analysed, weighed, examined under magnification, and the examination gave us 2 quiet facts that ripple backward through every theory ever proposed. Fact 1. The metal. The alloy is a copper alloy of decent quality, bronze with a measure of lead in it, which makes the casting flow better. An entirely professional choice. Nothing exotic, but nothing cheap. And that single alloy, professional and unshowy, is worth setting against the whole population, because when the specialists have put many dodecahedra under the same patient analysis, the metal turns out to be as various as everything else about them. Most are bronze, copper alloyed with tin, the honest workhorse metal of the Roman world. But the recipe wanders from object to object the way a family recipe wanders from kitchen to kitchen. Some carry a good measure of lead, deliberately added, because lead lowers the temperature at which the metal turns liquid and makes it run into the fine corners of a mould more willingly, exactly the friend you want when you are trying to fill 20 little knobs in one pour. Some carry zinc, which makes the alloy technically a brass, warmer and more golden when it is fresh. Some are nearly pure of those additions, a cleaner bronze. There is no single mixture that says, this is what a dodecahedron is made of, in the way that Roman coinage or Roman military fittings were held to their standards. Each workshop, it seems, reached for the crucible it had, and the scrap it had, and the habits it had, and poured. And the sizes wander just as freely. And here I can be a little more precise for you, because holding the range in your mind is one of the quiet pleasures of the thing. Line them up from smallest to largest, and it is a gentle slope, not a set of steps. The very smallest are hardly 4 centimetres across, the size of that walnut we keep returning to, light enough to forget in a closed hand. The largest climb past 11 centimetres, the grapefruit, the Norton Disney giant among them, heavy enough to want 2 hands and a moment of respect. And in between lies every size the slope allows, 5 centimetres, 7, 9. No 2 specimens are greying, no clustering around a favoured measure, no standard bushel or standard span that a maker was aiming for and missing. The weights follow the sizes, from something that rides in a pocket to something with the heft of a good apple, and again, no target, no norm. If you set the whole known family on one long shelf and walked its length, you would pass through the entire scale without ever stopping at a size that repeats, and you would pass through the entire palette of Roman bronze craft too, the honey golds and the leaded greys and the brasses, and by the end of the shelf you would have learned the lesson the metal keeps teaching, which is that whatever governed these objects, it was not a specification. It was an idea, cast 130 different ways, and the variety does not stop at the metal and the measure, it runs right down into the ornament, into the small decisions a maker made with the graver once the casting was clean. Look closely at the corners and you find that even the knobs are not one thing. On some specimens they are plain little spheres, smooth as beads. On others they are collared, ringed at the base with a fine-turned groove, as if each were a tiny goblet stood on the corner. On a few they swell almost into knops or buttons, and on at least one strange cousin they are barely there at all, reduced to gentle bumps. And the faces carry their own signatures. Around the holes, most makers cut concentric circles with a compass point, and you can count the rings and read a kind of handwriting in them. One workshop content with a single ring, another laying down 2 or 3 nested circles about every mouth. Another adding little drilled dots between the holes like the pips on a die. Another leaving the bronze austere and unmarked. No manual dictated any of this. Nobody wrote, cut 2 rings about each hole and collar the knobs, and yet the impulse to decorate, to make the thing not merely correct but handsome, shows up again and again across provinces that never traded notes, which tells you the makers cared about the object as an object, took pride in it, finished it the way you finish a thing meant to be seen and kept rather than used up and discarded. That too is a clue, quieter than the map but pointing the same way. You do not lavish the graver on a gauge, you lavish it on something that matters to the eye. Back 2, and lean in close for this one, the wear. There is none. No wear marks. The surfaces of the holes are crisp, the knobs are not rubbed or flattened or scratched in any repeating pattern. The edges keep their engraved detail. 17 centuries in the soil leave corrosion, of course, but corrosion is chemistry, and use is friction, and specialists can tell them apart, and on this object, as on almost every well-preserved dodecahedron ever studied closely, the friction of use simply is not there. Now think about what your own hands do to your own tools. Think of the smooth patch on a spade handle, the shine on old scissors, the worn spot where a thumb has rested on a knife 10,000 times. Bronze is softer than steel. If dodecahedra spent their lives being handled hard, threaded with cord, knocked with pegs, gripped in field conditions by soldiers or surveyors or knitters, a century of that should sign its name into the metal. Instead they come to us crisp. Whatever their life was, it was gentle. A life on a shelf perhaps, a life in a cloth wrapping, taken out on certain days, a life of being looked at, or held quietly, or feared a little. The Norton Disney object went off for study and conservation, and the group that found it suddenly found themselves minor national celebrities, invited to bring their dodecahedron to festivals and museums, where thousands of people cued to look at a small bronze cage and hear the same beautiful sentence repeated over and over. We do not know what it is. I want to pause on how rare that sentence has become and how people respond to it, because I watch this happen and it tells you something about why this mystery has such a hold. We live drowning in answers. Any fact you want arrives in a second, thin and frictionless. And here is a small green object in a glass case, and beside it a museum label, and where every other label in the building confidently says oil lamp, 1st century or brooch, military type, this one essentially says, in polite curatorial language, your guess is as good as ours. People stand in front of that label longer than any other in the room, children especially, because it is not a fact, it is an invitation. The little sign does not close the story, it opens it, and every visitor walks away carrying a private theory, and none of them can be told they are wrong. There are few pleasures so relaxing, if we are honest, as a question with no examiner, which brings us at last to the theories themselves, and I should warn you with real affection about what lies ahead. More than 50 distinct explanations have been published for the Roman dodecahedron over the past 3 centuries. 50. Scholarly ones with footnotes and amateur ones on the backs of envelopes, brilliant ones and batty ones, and every single one of them, every one, runs into the same low wall sooner or later. I am going to walk you through the best of them now, one at a time, gently, the practical tools first, then the cleverer machines, then the theory that went viral in our own century and charmed half the internet, and finally, deepest in the night, the explanations that leave the world of tools behind altogether and step into the temple. Take them the way you would take a tray of curiosities, lifting each one, turning it in the light, setting it down again. None of them has to be true tonight. That is the luxury of this particular mystery. We are not solving a crime. We are keeping company with a question, and the question is very old and very patient, and it has all night, and so do we. But before we lift the first theory from the tray, I want to walk you down the gallery and introduce you to the rest of the family, because so far you have really only met 2 of them properly. The one from the Hertfordshire field and the one from the Lincolnshire pit. And a family of 130 deserves more than 2 introductions. Museums across Northern Europe keep them, usually 1 or 2 to a town, small green celebrities in provincial cases, and each one arrived in the light by its own crooked road, and the roads are half the pleasure. Come down the gallery with me. Here is one that spent the dark centuries in a river, dredged up in the age of steam when Europe straightened its waterways, hauled out of the mud in a bucket of gravel and very nearly thrown back. River finds have a particular look, smoothed and darkened, the green patina burnished by centuries of moving water, and this one was noticed only because a foreman on the dredging crew liked curiosities and kept a box of them in the site office. It sat in that box, the story goes, between a medieval spur and half a clay pipe, until someone from the town museum came asking after Roman coins, and the foreman said, "Well, what do you make of this?" Here is another that came up in a vineyard, in the valley of the Moselle, not far downstream from the workshops of Trier, turned up by a grower trenching new vines. Wine country is generous to archaeology, because vines demand deep digging and careful eyes, and the terraces above the river have been handing up Roman oddments for as long as anyone has kept records. The grower's family, it is said, kept the object on a windowsill for a generation, using it as nothing at all, a thing to look at against the light, before a visiting schoolmaster recognised what it must be and wrote a letter to a professor, and the professor arrived on the next coach. I like the windowsill years. Of all the lives a dodecahedron has led, honorary fruit bowl ornament in a wine grower's kitchen is somehow among the most fitting, valued again for exactly what it offers. Presence without explanation. Here is one found by soldiers of a much later empire, digging fortifications where a Roman fort had stood 17 centuries earlier, war trenching down into war trenching, and the men who found it, so the account runs, argued about it around their cook fire that night, and their sergeant, a practical man, declared it was obviously the head of a mace. And for 50 years afterward the museum label said "mace head?" because the sergeant said so with confidence, and confidence is 9/10 of a museum label. It was not the head of a mace. The knobs are too small and too regular, and no shaft hole exists. But I tell you the story because it shows how the object collects explanations the way a hull collects barnacles. Every generation of finders scraping off the last one and supplying their own. Here is a fragment, just 3 faces and a scatter of knobs, cracked apart either by frost or by force long ago, from the hill country near the wall in the north of Britain. Fragments matter more than they look, because a fragment means the count of 130 is a floor and not a ceiling, the visible edge of that vanished population we spoke of, the hundreds that went back into the melting pot when their meaning died with their keepers. Bronze was money in the ground. Every surviving dodecahedron is a small miracle of neglect, a thing that slipped through the recycling of 40 generations because it happened to be lying somewhere nobody profitable ever looked. Here is one that came out of a burned house in a town on the Gaulish River roads from the ash layer of a fire that took an entire street sometime in the troubled 3rd century. The excavators found it in what had been the main room, dropped or shelved among the ordinary wreckage of a household, carbonized furniture fittings, a scatter of coins, the iron skeleton of a strongbox. Somebody's whole domestic world pressed flat under the collapse. No temple, no grave, no hoard, just a home, which is its own kind of evidence, and worth filing carefully beside the grander finds. Because whatever else the dodecahedron was, at least sometimes it lived in the house, among the people, near the hearth, close enough to the family's money to burn with it. And here is perhaps the oddest address in the registry, a specimen recovered from the remains of a theatre, a proper Gallo-Roman theatre, with its half-moon of stone seating banked against a hillside, where on festival days a whole district would gather for spectacles and speeches, and the rites that in that country always came braided together with entertainment. What a dodecahedron was doing there is anyone's guess, and I mean that in the most literal way, since guessing is the licensed sport of this entire field. But it is worth knowing that theatres in the Gaulish countryside were rarely just theatres. They were built beside temples, filled on holy days, emptied by the calendar of the gods. And an object lost or left or offered in such a place sits closer to the festival than to the stage. File that one too. And here is my favourite of the accidental rediscoveries, a specimen that was excavated, catalogued, and then lost again, not in the earth this time, but in a museum, mislaid among the uncatalogued backlog of a storeroom for the better part of a lifetime, until a cataloguing project in our own era opened the right wooden drawer and found it lying in tissue paper beside a label written in a dead curator's copperplate hand. Museums, you should know, are honeycombed with such sleepers. The great collections hold vastly more than they can ever study, and somewhere in the basements of Europe, almost certainly, another dodecahedron or two is waiting out the decades in the dark of a drawer, having pulled off the neat trick of being lost twice. When the count of 130 ticks upward next, it may not come from a field at all. It may come from a stocktake. And since we are naming addresses, let me give you a proper handful of them, the real places on the real map, because a mystery told only in round numbers stays a little abstract, and these objects earned their particulars. Go to the eastern edge of Gaul, to the town the Romans called Augusta Raurica, near the great bend of the Upper Rhine, a place with a theatre and a forum and a mint, and you find not one dodecahedron, but a small local cluster, as if the district had a taste for them, or a workshop that supplied them. Cross into the German provinces and the names come thick, each a fort or a colony strung along the river frontier, Bonn where the Legion sat, and Cologne the proud provincial capital, and Trier upstream on the Moselle where we watched our smith work. And around each of them the trowel has turned up its example, sometimes in the rubble of a townhouse, sometimes in the fill of a ditch, sometimes with no context left at all, because it was lifted in the 1800s by someone who kept the object and threw the dirt away. There is one from a Roman villa in the Rhineland, a working country estate with its barns and its bath suite. where the object lay in the ruins of the main house among the ordinary fittings of a prosperous farming family, neither hidden nor enshrined, simply present, a member of the household. There is one from a grave field in the low country the Rhine crosses on its way to the sea, laid with the dead in ground the Romans shared with the local Batavian people, whose horsemen the empire prized and whose gods the empire never quite learned. Come back across the water to Britain and the flags cluster again, and the counties read like a tour of the old province, a specimen from the Middle Shires, a specimen from the southwest, a fragment from the hard hill country up near the wall, where the empire ran out of patience with the north. There is a fine one tied to a Roman town beneath a quiet English cathedral city, and there are others whose exact find spots the antiquaries never troubled to write down, so that the object survives, but its last address is lost, which is its own small tragedy, because in this trade the where is half the meaning. And then there are the hoards, and I want to linger on those, because a hoard is the most human of all the contexts, a snapshot of a single frightened decision. We spoke of the one at Crefeld, the coins and the cage buried together against the raiders. There are others of that kind, moments of panic pressed into the ground and never lifted, and each tells the same short story in a different hand. Somebody heard that the frontier had failed. Somebody counted their minutes and their treasures, and the treasures that went into the pot were the coins, the future in metal, and among them chosen over furniture and tools, and the good bronze pans that any thief would want, the 12-hold cage. You do not have to know what it was to know what it meant to them, and what it meant was, this comes with us. This we do not leave behind. Set all these addresses side by side, the villa and the fort and the vineyard and the grave field and the panic hoard and the deliberate pit, and a shape starts to show through, faint but real. This was not a thing of one class or one trade. It lived in the farmhouse and the townhouse, it travelled with soldiers, it went into the ground with the dead, it was worth saving when the world ended. Whatever it was, it belonged to the whole society of the North, up and down, and it belonged to that society and to no other on earth. Now hold all those places in your mind at once, the lamps burning across 3 provinces, and come back with me to the single case in front of us, because after the map, the individual object always looks smaller and stranger than you expect. And here, in a case by itself, is the smallest of the family, hardly bigger than a walnut, so light in the hand that visitors laugh when the curator, on rare occasions, lets someone feel the replica. Its holes would not admit your smallest finger. Whatever story you have been quietly building for the big ones, the little one is standing at the end of the gallery to complicate it, which is, you will find, the dodecahedron's favourite trick. Every generalisation dies of a specimen. They are bronze, except the one that is silver over lead. They are 12-sided, except the cousin with 20. They are hand-sized, except the walnut and the grapefruit. It is as if the category itself refuses to hold still, and the refusals have been going on since the very beginning of the study, which is the other half of the tour I owe you, because the shelf of books about these objects is nearly as odd as the objects, and rather older than you might guess. After that first candlelit London evening in 1739, the finds trickled in through the 1700s, a report here, an engraving there, gentlemen writing to gentlemen. It was the 1800s that turned the trickle to a stream, the great century of digging, when railways and factories and antiquarian societies between them moved more European earth than the previous 1,000 years combined. Finds multiplied, and with them, papers, learned journals in 3 languages took up the question. Provincial societies heard lectures on winter evenings, the gas lamps hissing, the specimen passed around on a velvet cushion, while some whiskered doctor of philology laid out his solution to polite applause, and every solution differed, and every audience went home satisfied, and none of it stuck. By the early 20th century, scholars attempting to simply summarise the literature were counting the published explanations in dozens, and a tone creeps into the academic prose of that era that I have come to love. A tone of elaborate, exhausted courtesy, as one ageing professor after another lays out all previous theories, dismantles them with regret, offers his own with a flourish. and is himself dismantled with regret a decade later. The dodecahedron is the great humbler of confident men. It has been receiving definitive explanations for a quarter of a millennium the way a lighthouse receives weather. And through all of it, the objects themselves kept arriving, indifferent, identical in spirit and dissimilar in every measurement, out of graves and rivers and vineyards, as if the ancient North were feeding new evidence into the debate at exactly the pace required to keep it unresolved. If I sound fond of this history, it is because I am. There is a particular sweetness in watching 3 centuries of very intelligent people be perfectly productively wrong, because their wrongness is never wasted. Every failed theory rules something out, and ruling out is the slow arithmetic of truth. The candlestick men taught us to look for wax, and mostly there is none. The macehead sergeants taught us to check for shaft wear, and there is none. The gauge enthusiasts measured every hole in Europe, and their beautiful tables of measurements, compiled to prove a standard, became the very data set that proved there is no standard, the finest own goal in the whole literature and the most useful. We know as much as we do about what the dodecahedron is not, precisely because so many people were so sure about what it was, which is worth remembering, gently, the next time you feel foolish for being certain about something and wrong. You were at worst contributing to the arithmetic. So now you have met the family and the biographers both, the walnut and the grapefruit, the river ones and the vineyard one, the fragments from the wall, the silver cousin we will visit properly in the deep of the night, and the long shelf of confident books that the objects have politely outlived. You know the shape of the evidence now almost as well as the specialists do, and you have earned the theories at last, and we will take them as a gallery takes its visitors, easiest first, strangest last, with the lights going down slowly as we walk. One more thing before the first theory, and it is the investigator's confession. The thing I wish someone had told me when I first fell down this particular well. Watch the dates on the theories, line them up in order, and something quietly funny emerges. Something that tells you as much about us as about the bronze. The theories mirror their eras, always, without exception. The gentlemen of the 1700s and the parlour-minded Victorians looked at the dodecahedron and saw the furniture of their own comfortable rooms. They proposed candle holders and stands for flowers and ornamental finials for railings and staffs, drawing-room answers from a drawing-room civilization. Then came the age of iron and empire and measurement, engineers and artillery officers and men with slide rules, and behold, the dodecahedron became an instrument, a rangefinder, a surveying device, a calibration gauge, because a civilization that measured everything assumed Rome measured everything too. The wars filled the literature with military readings, weapon heads and camp games for soldiers, and equipment for gunners. Then the 20th century softened into homecraft and hobbies, and the knitting theory arrived, warm and domestic, and conquered the age of online video, the first theory in the whole history of the problem that could be demonstrated in 90 seconds to 10 million people. A theory perfectly shaped for its medium, as the velvet cushion lectures were shaped for theirs. And in our own anxious, meaning hungry decades, the pendulum has swung toward ritual, toward the sacred, toward mystery honoured rather than solved, and I will let you decide, when we get there, whether that is because the evidence points that way, or because we do, though I will argue, when the hour comes, that for once the era and the evidence agree. The lesson is not that everyone was foolish. The lesson is that an object with no voice becomes a mirror, and every century that leans over it sees its own face rippling in the bronze, and knowing that, you and I can at least try to catch our own reflections in time, though I make no promises, because the mirror is very good at its work, and we are inside our own era, as surely as the Victorians were inside theirs. So how do we keep honest, staring into a mirror? The specialists have 4 tests, 4 quiet questions they put to every candidate explanation, and I want to hand them to you now, because you will use them all night, and there is a real pleasure, a puzzle-page pleasure, in running each theory through them yourself in the dark. The first test is where. Objects remember their work. Use leaves friction. Friction leaves polish and grooves and rounding, always in the same places, in the places the work happened, and conservators read those marks under magnification as easily as print. A theory that requires heavy handling must show me handled metal. Remember the crisp knobs. Keep them beside you all night, like a cool side of the pillow. The second test is standardization. Tools that participate in systems must agree with each other. Weights agree, gauges agree, military kit agrees, coinage agrees, that is what makes them systems, and Rome was the great mistress of agreement. 130 specimens that agree on nothing measurable are 130 votes against any theory that needs a system. The third test is context. Where does the ground say the object lived and died? Kitchen floors tell one story, temple precincts another, graves a third, and a theory about, say, kitchens must explain why the thing keeps turning up in coin hoards and burials and riverbeds, the three most deliberate addresses in archaeology. And the fourth test, the one this particular mystery has made famous, is the texts. Rome wrote, if the object had a trade, the trade should have a paper trail, a word, a price in an edict, a line in a will, a joke in a play, one letter among the thousands from the frontier mentioning that the new one arrived and the old one cracked. Silence in one document means nothing. Silence in a whole civilization's filing cabinet is data. And before we let that fourth test settle, I want to be fair to the silence, because a skeptic could reasonably say, well, Rome lost most of what it wrote, whole libraries burned, whole shelves rotted, absence of the word is not proof of absence of the thing. That is true, and it is the honest objection, and the way you answer it is not by arguing but by comparison. So let me set a few of Rome's other puzzles beside our own, its other objects that leave a modern specialist scratching, because the comparison is where the silence starts to speak. Consider the Roman devices we do not fully understand, but at least can name. There is a bronze hand, cast life-size, its fingers frozen in a strange gesture, crusted with tiny symbols and little figures, pine cones and serpents and small animals, dozens of them turning up across the empire, and for a long time nobody was sure what they were. Until the texts and the context slowly gave them up. They belong to a mystery cult. They are votive hands raised to a saviour god, and the word for the god survives, and the rites leave a faint paper trail, and so the puzzle, though not solved to the last symbol, has a name and a home. Consider the little folding pocket sundials, ingenious travel instruments a Roman could carry from city to city and adjust for the latitude, so clever that when one was first found, people could hardly believe the ancients had made it. And yet we know exactly what they are, because Rome wrote about time and travel endlessly, and the instruments sit inside that writing like a word in a sentence. Consider even the most famous of all the ancient enigmas, the geared bronze calculator hauled up from a shipwreck in the Greek seas, a machine of 30 and more meshing wheels that modelled the wandering of the sun and moon and the great cycles of the calendar, a thing so far ahead of its apparent time that it stunned the century that decoded it. Even that, the most astonishing survival from the ancient world, is not nameless. Its inscriptions can be read. Its purpose is understood. It sits, however improbably, inside the long tradition of Greek astronomy that the texts describe, and scholars can point to the authors whose knowledge it embodies. That is the pattern. Do you see it? Rome and Greece made difficult, clever, mysterious things, and the difficult, clever, mysterious things almost always leave a thread back into the written world, a word, a rite, an author, a price. The votive hand has its cult. The sundial has its treatises. The great gearwork has its astronomers. Every one of them, however strange, can be introduced to you by name. And the dodecahedron cannot. It is not that we have a faint mention we cannot interpret, or a garbled word we cannot place. It is that we have nothing at all, no word, no rite named, no author, no price in any edict, no line in any will, no joke in any comedy, across the entire surviving literature of 1,000 years of the most document-drenched civilization the ancient world produced. And that is a different kind of silence from the ordinary loss of manuscripts. Because the ordinary loss is random, it takes the great work and the laundry list alike, and yet the laundry lists survive by the thousand. The socks and the underpants and the beer orders. The small change of daily writing that no one thought worth preserving and that survived precisely because it was too dull to burn. If the dodecahedron were an ordinary tool of daily life, some fragment of that daily writing should have brushed against it by now, the way it brushed against every lamp and pot and pin. The fact that nothing has in 3 centuries of looking is why the specialists stopped treating the silence as an accident and started treating it as a clue. A thing that leaves objects everywhere and words nowhere is telling you something about which of the 2 worlds it lived in, the world that wrote or the world that did not. Hold that against the 4 tests as we take them up. 4 tests then: where, standard, context, text. Say them once to yourself, slowly, like turning 4 smooth stones in your pocket, because here is what I can promise about the hours ahead, and it is a promise of a very particular, very restful kind. Every practical theory you are about to hear will fail at least 2 of the 4. Most fail 3. 1, the most beautiful, fails all 4 and remains beautiful anyway. And the theories waiting at the deep end of the night, the temple theories, have a different relationship with the tests altogether, not passing them exactly, but slipping past them, the way water slips past a sieve made for stones, and whether that makes them stronger or merely unfalsifiable is the question I will leave sitting on your chest, very likely, sometime around the 3rd hour. There is no need to keep score. That is the other thing I should say, here at the threshold, while the gallery lights are still half up. You are not required to have an opinion by morning. Archaeology on television arrives breathless, every documentary a courtroom rushing to verdict, experts staged against each other, music insisting that everything is about to be revealed. Real archaeology is almost the opposite temperament. It is a discipline of patience and of comfort, with the unresolved, closer to gardening than to detection. And its practitioners will tell you, in their unguarded moments, that the questions that stay open are the ones that keep the whole enterprise alive and humble and honest. The dodecahedron is the patron object of that temperament. It has kept its question open for nearly 300 years and been nothing but generous the whole time, generous with wonder, generous with humility, generous with the particular calm that settles on a person who finally stops needing to know. That calm is the real subject of tonight, if I am honest with you, and the bronze is only its occasion. So, the lights down then, the tray before us. 12 faces, 20 knobs, a dozen unrepeatable holes, 4 tests in your pocket, 3 centuries of the defeated at our backs, and all the time in the world. Let us begin where the debate itself began, in the gentlest possible place, with the theory that sees in all that fire-born geometry nothing more alarming than a place to put a candle. The candlestick theory is less silly than it sounds. Picture it. The object sits on a table, resting stably on one face, because a dodecahedron always rests stably. That is one of the graces of the shape. A candle of the Roman kind, a rough tallow taper, is pushed into the uppermost hole, and the varying diameters suddenly have a possible meaning, because candles were hand-dipped and came in no standard thickness, so a holder with 12 different sockets would fit whatever candle the household had. Turn the object until you find the hole that grips. It is a genuinely clever idea, and it has one piece of physical evidence behind it, which is that at least one dodecahedron, found in Germany, was reported to contain traces of wax when it was examined. For a moment that looks like the case closed. But hold the theory up to the light and the problems come through like watermarks. If it is a candlestick, it is the most expensive candlestick in the northern provinces, a week of skilled labour and a fistful of valuable bronze to do what a lump of clay with a thumb hole did in every Roman house for free. Rome had candlesticks, we have thousands of them, in clay and iron and bronze, and they look like candlesticks. A dish, a spike, a handle, done. None of them is a hollow geometric cage that took a master a week. And the wax, that one seductive trace of wax, has an unromantic alternative explanation that you already know, because I showed it to you in the workshop. These objects were cast by the lost wax method. Wax was the first body the thing ever had. Residue deep in a casting is exactly what the manufacturing process could leave behind, and no second dodecahedron has ever repeated the finding. So we set the candlestick down, respectfully, like a shell returned to its beach, and we pick up the next theory, which at least has the virtue of taking the holes seriously. Perhaps it is a gauge. A measuring instrument. 12 holes of graded sizes. What measures things by passing them through holes? Quite a lot, actually, a coin gauge, said some, for checking that gold and silver coins were true to size, a fraud catcher for the marketplace. A gauge for water pipes, said others, since Roman plumbing came in standard bores and somebody had to check them. A gauge for sling stones or arrow shafts or rope. It is a sensible family of ideas with a fatal genetic flaw, and by now you can probably recite it with me. No standardization. For a gauge to be a gauge, the sizes are the whole soul of the instrument. Every coin gauge in an empire must agree with every other, or coins true in Cologne are false in York, and the instrument is worse than useless. But the dodecahedra agree on nothing. The holes of one bear no relation to the holes of the next. No two objects would pass the same set of coins or pipes or stones. A world of gauges that all disagree is not a system of measurement, it is an argument. And there is a quieter problem underneath, one a workshop mind spots at once. If you want 12 graded holes, you do not need a hollow pentagonal cage with 20 ornamental knobs, cast at great cost. You need a flat strip of bronze with 12 holes drilled in a row, which is exactly what real Roman gauges look like, and they survive, and they are boring, because working tools usually are. Nobody decorates a tape measure with the geometry of the heavens. So the gauge goes back on the tray, and we lift the next idea, one with a little more play in it. Perhaps it is exactly what it looks like when it sits in your palm asking to be tossed. A die. A gaming piece. The Romans were ferocious gamblers. Dice have 12-sided cousins even in the ancient world, and a dodecahedron is the natural body for a 12-fold chance. Some have even imagined it as a piece in a game of skill, something thrown and caught, or rolled between wagers in the smoke of a frontier tavern. I confess a fondness for this one, because it is the only theory that gives the object any fun. But the objections queue up quickly. The holes are different sizes, which means the faces carry different weights of missing metal, which means the throw is biased, and a gambler's die that everyone knows is biased has a short and violent life. The knobs make it roll badly and land ambiguously. The faces, on almost every known specimen, are unnumbered and unmarked, and a die with no values is a riddle of its own. And the cost, always the cost. A week of a bronzer smith's labour for a die, when Romans cut serviceable dice from bone in an hour. There are real Roman gaming pieces beyond counting in our museums, and they are cheap and worn and loved, and the dodecahedra are none of those three things. And while we are in the playful corner of the tray, let me deal quickly and affectionately with the little crowd of also-rans that gathers here, because the full published list is a garden of its own, and you deserve at least a stroll through it. It has been called a child's toy, which founders on the cost. We do not cast toys in a week of master's labour, and on the fact that toys are the most battered objects archaeology knows, and these are pristine. It has been called a finial, an ornament for the top of a staff or a standard or a fine piece of furniture, which is not absurd, and hold on to it loosely, because a version of that idea will come back transformed in the deep of the night, wearing much stranger clothes. It has been called a holder for flowers, a Victorian suggestion if ever there was one, 12 stems through 12 holes, and I defy you to think of it now without imagining a legionary arranging posies, which is perhaps unfair, but the mind does what it does. It has been called a practice piece for apprentices, a demonstration of skill, and that one too will return in better dress later on. It has been called a head for a weapon, as our confident sergeant insisted, though it is hollow, thin-walled, and would crumple like a lantern. Each of these has its charm, and each earned a paper or a chapter once upon a time. And each, you will notice, obeys the rule we caught earlier, the mirror rule, nurseries and parlours and parade grounds, each theorist furnishing the mystery from their own front room. Which brings us to the where again, our quiet judge in the corner, and it is worth letting that judge speak fully now, because from here on, every theory must face it. Almost every use we have tried so far, the candle socket, the market gauge, the tavern die, is a life of handling, of friction, of knocks, and the objects simply do not carry the scars of any such life. It is not only that we cannot find their purpose, it is that they refuse to look used, and things that are owned for centuries but never worn out belong to a particular small family. Heirlooms, regalia, offerings, things, kept wrapped in cloth in a chest and brought out on the day that mattered. Keep the judge's words in mind as we go up the scale of ambition, because the theories now stop being household guesses and start being machines. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as men of science took up the puzzle, a grander family of explanations bloomed. The dodecahedron, they proposed, was an instrument. A surveyor's tool, perhaps, for the army that measured the world. Sight through a pair of opposed holes, the argument runs, and the differing diameters create fixed angles of view. Hold the object at a known distance from the eye, find the pair of holes through which a distant soldier or standard exactly fills the opening, and geometry hands you his distance. A rangefinder with no moving parts, cast in bronze, indestructible in a soldier's pack. And a map lends the idea a haunting plausibility, because the finds do hug the military north, the Rhine, the Danube, the wall, the fortress country, exactly where an army instrument ought to turn up. For 100 years this was the respectable theory, and you can feel its attraction even now. Standing in the museum, closing one eye, looking through the little green cage at the far wall, and imagining a legionary doing the same across the misty Rhine at a barbarian shore. It is a beautiful theory, and it is almost certainly wrong, and it is wrong for the reason you already know by heart our old refrain, and I will let you say it to yourself this time, softly, like a password between us. If distance is measured by hole sizes, then hole sizes are everything, and they must be cut to a standard, engraved with values, repeated from instrument to instrument across the whole army, and they are not. Not once. Not anywhere. No graduations. No numerals. No two alike. An army does not issue 100 rangefinders that each tell a different truth. Besides which, we know the instruments the Roman army actually surveyed with, Vigroma with its plumb lines, the dioptra, the measuring rods, because the texts describe them and reliefs depict them, and a surveyor's whole kit was found in the ruins of Pompeii. The army wrote its tools down. It always wrote its tools down, and in that long, careful literature of Roman measurement, our object, as ever, is nowhere. So the great bronze rangefinder joins the candlestick and the coin gauge on the tray of lovely failures. But the military family does not give up so easily, and in fairness to it, we should lift its two other members from the tray before we move on, because the men of measurement were nothing if not inventive, and each of these caught real scholars for a while. The first is the artillery idea, and it is a cousin of the rangefinder with a harder edge. Rome's armies carried torsion engines, the bolt throwers and stone throwers that could reach across a valley, and a good crew needed to judge the range and the elevation of a shot the way a modern gunner does, by eye and by rule of thumb, and by instrument where they had one. Perhaps, the argument ran, the dodecahedron was a gunner's aid, sighted through to fix an angle of elevation, or used to set the consistent geometry of the frame, a soldier's calculating toy for the deadly arithmetic of a siege. It is a manly, plausible-sounding idea, and it dies on the same 3 stones as its cousin. No standardization, so no two crews could share a reading. No wear, when a piece of siege kit lives a hard life of knocks and grit. And no mention when Rome wrote about its war engines with real love, named their parts, argued about their torsion, and would surely, somewhere in all that soldierly detail, have named the little bronze cage that helped aim them. It is nowhere in the manuals of war, and the manuals of war are long. The second is gentler and cleverer, and I have a soft spot for it. Perhaps the object was a kind of portable reckoner for the calendar, not a machine of gears like the great one from the Greek shipwreck, but a simpler mnemonic body, 12 faces for 12 months, the holes and knobs and engraved rings serving a priest or a farmer as a thing to turn in the hand while counting off the feast days, the market days, the days lucky and unlucky that every ancient life was ruled by. It has the merit of finally giving the 12 a meaning that is not decorative, and it points honestly in the direction the deep theories will take us later tonight. But as a practical device it stumbles too, because if the 12 faces were a working calendar, you would expect them marked, numbered, lettered. Something to count against. And on the classic bronze specimens the faces are blank, mute, unnumbered, carrying only their holes and their rings. A calendar you cannot read is not a calendar. It is at most a reminder of the idea of one, and that, curiously, is a very different and much stranger thing, and we will come back to it in the dark hours when we stop asking what the object did and start asking what it meant. For now, set the gunner's aid and the pocket calendar down beside the rangefinder, 3 military-minded guesses that each caught a corner of the truth, the north, the angles, the 12, and each let the rest slip through its fingers. And now, with the night getting deeper around us, to the theory that none of the Victorians saw coming, the one that came not from a general or a professor, but from craftspeople with yarn in their laps, the one that, in our own century, made half the internet fall in love with a Roman mystery, the knitting theory. And, whatever you have heard about it, the truth is both sillier and more wonderful than you think. Here is how the knitting theory works, and I want you to picture it with your hands, because it is a theory made entirely of hands. Take the dodecahedron and hold it with one hole facing up. Around that hole stand 5 of the little corner knobs, and it is the knobs, not the holes, that this theory finally explains. Loop a strand of wool around one knob, then the next, working around the 5 like a maypole. Now, with a pick or a fingertip, lift the lower loops over the upper, one by one, around and around, and something quietly miraculous begins to happen down inside the bronze. A knitted cord starts to grow, a hollow tube of looped wool, descending into the object and emerging, stitch by stitch, from the hole below. Crafters call the technique spool knitting, or French knitting, and children still do it today with a wooden spool and 4 nails, producing endless woolen snakes to no purpose except delight. Do it on a dodecahedron, the theory says, and the purpose appears. The 5 knobs around each face give you a 5-loop tube, and the different hole sizes now sing in harmony at last, because the size of the hole shapes the size of the tube, and a graded set of 12 tube sizes is exactly what you need if what you are knitting is a glove. 1 tube for the thumb, a slimmer tube for the little finger, a wider one for the palm. The theory arrived in earnest in our own century, when crafters, not academics, took up the question, and one experimenter in particular sat down with a replica dodecahedron, a ball of wool, and a camera, and simply did it. Knitted the fingers of a Roman glove on a bronze dodecahedron, on video, while the internet watched. And the internet, bless it, lost its mind. Here was a 100-year-old scholarly deadlock 50 theories deep, seemingly broken open not by a professor with a laser scanner, but by someone who knew what to do with yarn. The demonstration videos gathered millions of views. Museum gift shops began selling knitting dodecahedra. For a while, in the public mind, the case was closed. The Roman dodecahedron was a glove-knitting tool, and the North-only map even seemed to agree. Because where does the empire need wool gloves? Not in Egypt. Not in sunny Italy. In Britain. On the Rhine. On the freezing wall, where we know from their own letters that soldiers begged their families for warm clothing. There is a real letter, and I will tell you about it properly later tonight, in which a Roman soldier at a fort near the wall is sent socks and underpants from home. Gloves for the frontier, knitted on a bronze form, It all clicks together with a satisfaction you can feel in your teeth. And now, having given the theory its full day in the sun, I must, with genuine reluctance, invite the witnesses for the other side, because they are many, and they are gentle, and they are devastating. First witness. The history of knitting itself. Knitting, true knitting with loops, is oddly young. The earliest knitted fabrics we possess come from Egypt many centuries after the fall of the Western Empire, and from all the vast surviving wardrobe of the Roman world, the mummy portraits, the frozen bog finds, the dry desert textiles, thousands upon thousands of scraps of actual Roman cloth, not one knitted stitch has ever been identified. Not one. Romans wore woven cloth, and when they needed stretch and shape, socks and mittens and caps, they used a slower looping technique done with a single needle, worked stitch by stitch, no dodecahedron required, and we have those actual socks. If Romans across 3 centuries were knitting gloves on 100 bronze dodecahedra, they managed to do it without leaving behind a single knitted glove, or a picture of a knitted glove, or a word for knitting, anywhere, ever. Silence in the texts we have learned to live with tonight, but silence in the laundry too is a great deal to ask. Second witness. The objects themselves, and here the quiet judge in the corner clears his throat again. Wool on bronze, 20,000 loops lifted over those knobs per glove, gloves for a cold province, year after year. The knobs should be worn silky, grooved at the base as a whetstone grooves, polished as any tool polishes where the work runs over it. And they are not. The knobs come to us crisp, their casting detail intact. Third witness. The economics. Our recurring friend. A wooden dodecahedron, or a disc with 5 pegs, does the same knitting job precisely as well, and any village carpenter could make one in an afternoon for the price of lunch, and if such wooden tools existed we would perhaps never find them. Wood rots, fair enough. But then why does anyone, let alone 100 anyones, commission the week-long bronze masterpiece version of a peg spool? We do not cast our clothespins in silver. And the fourth witness, the smallest and largest specimens, walks in and simply holds up her hands. The smallest dodecahedra are the size of a walnut, their holes too tiny to pass any finger tube. The largest is a grapefruit that would knit a sleeve for a bear. If this is a glove tool, it comes in sizes for which no human hands exist. So the knitting theory sits down. And I want to be kind to it as it does, because it earned something the other theories never did. It made millions of people care about a piece of Roman metalwork, and it made the crucial point, better than any professor ever had, that the knobs demand explanation just as much as the holes do. Any final answer, if one ever comes, will have to seat both, but there is a deeper lesson in its rise and fall, one worth turning over as the night gets soft at the edges. The knitting theory conquered the internet, because it was demonstrated, and a demonstration feels like proof. Watch a glove finger emerge from the bronze and your whole body says, of course, that is what it is for. Yet all the demonstration ever proved is that a dodecahedron can be knitted on, just as it can hold a candle, just as it can be looked through, just as it can be thrown across a tavern. Almost any object can do almost anything. A boot can hammer nails. That does not make boots hammers. Between can and was lies the entire discipline of archaeology, and the gap is crossed not by ingenuity, but by evidence, wear, context, standardization, texts, and every plank of that bridge, in this case, is missing. The dodecahedron has now survived the household, the marketplace, the army, and the knitting basket. Each theory got one feature right: the stability, the holes, the map, the knobs, and each was wrecked on the features it ignored. And there is a pattern in the wreckage, have you noticed? Every practical theory dies the same 2 deaths: no standardization, no wear. Said differently, the object refuses, politely but absolutely, to be a tool. Refuses across 130 specimens and 3 centuries of manufacture. At some point, an honest investigator has to stop asking what job it did and start asking whether job was ever the right question. 50 answers deep, Perhaps the mystery is not that we have failed to find the use. Perhaps the mystery is our insistence that everything old must have had one. The Romans of the north spent real fortunes on these things, kept them gently, buried them deliberately, and never wore them out, and there is a category of object in every human culture, including yours and mine, that lives exactly that kind of life. We are going there now, into the deep end of the night, where the theories stop being about hands and start being about the sky. But on the way, I want to make one last stop in the daylight world, at the very edge of the empire, because before we can talk about what the Romans of the north believed, we should stand for a moment where they stood, on the frontier itself, in the cold, and feel what the world looked like from the places where the dodecahedra actually lived. Come and stand on the rampart of a fort on the lower Rhine. In December, in the 3rd century, it is an hour before dawn, the coldest hour, and the river below is a sheet of moving black glass with rafts of grey ice turning slowly in the current. On the walkway above the gate stands a watchman, and we may as well give him a name and a face. Invented but honest, like our bronzesmith. Call him Aelianus. He is a weathered man in his 40s, pale-skinned, his sandy hair cropped short under a woolen cap, an old scar through one eyebrow, and he is wearing every piece of clothing he owns, a rust-red tunic, a hooded grey cloak with the hood up, and boots stuffed with dried grass, because the army teaches you that trick in your first northern winter. Aelianus was born 800 miles from Italy and has never seen it. His grandfather was a Gaul. His mother prayed to a river goddess whose name no Roman poet ever learned to spell. He is, on paper, a soldier of Rome, and he speaks Latin with an accent the officers smile at, and this is the point I have carried you up onto this cold rampart to feel. The Roman north was not Rome. It was a border country in every sense, a place where the tidy Mediterranean empire lay draped like a blanket over an older world, and the older world breathed underneath it the whole time. In the towns behind this frontier, people worshipped Jupiter and Mercury in temples of a shape no Italian would recognize. Square Celtic sanctuaries wearing Roman dress. They paired the empire's gods with their own, Mars with a local warrior god, Apollo with a healer of springs, hedging every prayer both ways. They counted lucky and unlucky days by traditions their great-grandmothers kept. And it is in this world, and only in this world, this blended, misty, twice-believing world of the northwest provinces, that the dodecahedron exists at all. That map we drew together earlier, with all its lamps in the north and its darkness over Italy, is not just a distribution of finds. It is very nearly a map of where the Celtic peoples lived under Roman rule. That may be the single most important sentence I say tonight, so let me say it again, slowly, for the back of your drifting mind. The bronze dodecahedra appear where Celtic tradition and Roman craftsmanship overlap, and nowhere else on earth. Whatever this object meant, it did not mean it to Rome. It meant it to the Gauls and the Britons and the Rhinelanders inside Rome, a meaning the Mediterranean either never knew about or never cared to import. Now we know less about the beliefs of these peoples than we would like, because the Celts of the old free days famously refused to write their wisdom down. Their learned class, the Druids, trained for 20 years by memory alone, and the one thing every ancient author agrees on is what the Druids studied. Caesar himself, who fought them, wrote that they held long discussions about the stars and their movement, about the size of the universe and the earth, about the nature of things and the power of the gods. The scraps that survive of Celtic learning bear him out, and I will show you the greatest of those scraps a little deeper in the night. These were people for whom the sky was scripture, and counting was holy, and shapes could carry the weight of worlds, and they lived, remember, cheek by jowl with Greek geometry for centuries. A Gaulish nobleman's son in Trier or Leon could learn Plato in school in the morning and hear his grandmother's sky law at the hearth in the evening. If ever there were a soil where a Greek philosopher's shape of the heavens could take root and grow into something new, something local, something the empire's writers would never think to explain, it was this soil exactly. Hold that, And now let me pay a debt from earlier in the night. The soldier's letter. Because you have earned it, and because it will warm you, standing up here on this freezing rampart. At a fort called Vindolanda, just behind the line of Hadrian's Wall, the wet ground preserved something almost more precious than gold, which is paper. Wooden leaf tablets, thin as playing cards, with the actual ink handwriting of the garrison, hundreds of private letters from 18 centuries ago. There are invitations to a birthday party, written in the hand of a commander's wife, the earliest known Latin written by a woman. There are requests for leave, and complaints about the roads, and a report calling the local Britons by an army slang word, and there is the letter I promised you, in which somebody, a friend or a mother we do not know, writes to a soldier on this misery of a frontier, I have sent you socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and underpants. Underpants, across 1800 years, the tenderness of it lands without a scratch. Somebody far away worrying about a young man's cold feet at the end of the world. I tell you this partly because it is the most beloved letter in Roman Britain, and partly for the sharp small point hiding inside the warmth. This is how ordinary the surviving Roman record gets. Underwear made the record. Socks made the record. Birthday parties, beer orders, the price of nails, all made the record. And the dodecahedron did not. Whatever it was, it lived beneath or beyond or beside the world of things people wrote to each other about, and in a civilization that wrote about its underpants, that is not an oversight. That begins to look like a choice, and the older I get with this mystery, the more the silence itself seems like evidence, the missing word as loud as any inscription. 2 kinds of things go unwritten in any culture, after all. The things too trivial to mention, and the things too important. The pencil sharpener and the sacred. Nobody in your family has ever written an explanatory essay about what happens at a funeral, either, everyone knows. You learn it by standing there, in the room, with the others, and the knowledge passes hand to hand, generation to generation, without ever once touching paper. And if your whole civilization were reduced to its surviving paperwork, the meaning of its most solemn objects, the wedding ring, the christening gown, the folded flag, might be exactly the kind of thing that vanished. So as the sky over the Rhine turns from black to iron grey, and Alianus stamps his feet and waits for the relief watch, let us suppose, just suppose, that somewhere in his barracks chest, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, there is a small bronze cage with 12 holes that his Gaulish grandfather gave him, and that if you asked him what it was for, the question itself would puzzle him. For it is not for anything, friend. It is, and because it is, certain things are well with him that would otherwise not be well. That is a guess, of course, only a guess, dressed in a borrowed cloak on a rampart that fell 15 centuries ago. But it is time to descend the stair and follow the theories that take the guess seriously, the sky theories, the temple theories, and the singular specimens, one silver and lettered with the zodiac, one buried in a woman's grave, that keep those theories alive. The night is deep now, and this is the deep part of the story, and it was always going to end up here, under the stars, where the Druids kept their classroom. Before we take up the sky theories themselves, I want to do something a little unusual, and simply give you the sky. Because you and I have a disability, all of us born in the last 100 years or so, that no Roman and no Gaul ever suffered, and unless we correct for it, none of the deep theories will weigh what they ought to weigh. We have lost the night. I mean that literally. The great majority of human beings alive today, and very likely you, and certainly me, live under a permanent faint dome of electric glow, and have never in their lives seen the full unedited sky. The sky as standard equipment. The sky every single human being before our great-grandparents' time saw on every clear night of their lives from birth to death. So let me restore it to you for a few minutes, because it is a restful thing to imagine, and because it is the missing character in tonight's story. Go back to the settlement by the Rhine to Severina's town, but leave the houses now. Walk out past the last shuttered workshop, up the low hill behind the tanneries, and stop, and let your eyes open for half an hour as they were designed to open, and look up. There is no word for what is above you that we still use correctly. The books say stars, and you think of the few dozen weak points of light you have seen from a parking lot, and that is not what is above you. What is above you is a wilderness. Thousands of stars, layered back and back and back, bright ones blazing steadily through trembling faint ones, and behind them all, pouring across the whole dome from horizon to horizon, the river of the Milky Way, so dense and pale and structured that every culture on earth gave it a name and a road and a story, because you cannot look at it and believe it is nothing. The planets do not twinkle, they burn, wanderers on their private roads. The winter constellations come up over the forest like familiar giants. A falling star goes over every little while, common as birdsong, and all of it moves. That is the part we have most completely forgotten. Stay on the hill an hour, and the whole apparatus turns visibly around its fixed northern nail. Rising in the east, sinking in the west, one vast slow wheel, the biggest thing a human being has ever seen or ever will see with their own eyes, and it goes around once a day, and it has never once stopped, and every soul in that town below you could read it, not as a specialist accomplishment, but as one reads a clock face. The farmer knew which stars rose with the sowing and which with the slaughter. The bargeman knew the moon's phase tonight and tomorrow as surely as you know what day of the week it is, because the moon was the calendar and the river's moods followed it. Children knew the pole star before they knew their letters, mostly instead of their letters. The year was not a number on a document, it was a place in the wheel, and everyone always knew where in the wheel they stood, because the wheel was right there, every clear night, enormous, silent, perfectly reliable. The one thing in a dangerous world that never lied, never failed, never changed its mind. Now live under that for 10,000 years and ask yourself what it does to a people. We actually know some of the answer for the peoples of the dodecahedron country, and it is not guesswork. It comes to us in bronze. In a vineyard in eastern France, a plough turned up the shattered pieces of a great bronze tablet, and when the pieces were cleaned and fitted, they held an engraved calendar, in the Gaulish language, in Roman letters, from more or less the exact centuries of our little object. It is one of the treasures of European archaeology and one of the longest texts in any Celtic tongue, and what it records is a lunar and solar reckoning of 5 whole years at a stretch, months named and numbered, festival days flagged, lucky and unlucky halves marked out, with little correction periods slipped in to keep the moon's calendar and the sun's calendar walking in step, which is, if you have ever tried it, a genuinely difficult piece of applied astronomy. Whoever composed that tablet had inherited generations of patient sky-watching, recorded and refined and passed down. Caesar, remember, said the Druids' schooling took 20 years, all of it by memory, much of it about the heavens. The Gauls were not casual about the sky. They were, by every scrap of evidence we have, among the most careful sky-keepers of the ancient West, and they kept their keeping mostly off the page, in trained heads and in bronze. And both of those, the trained heads and the bronze, lived exactly where our lamps burned on the map. So now weigh what 12 might mean to such a people. To us, 12 is a carton of eggs. To the ancient sky-keeper, 12 was the architecture of time itself. 12 full moons, or very nearly, walk through one turning of the sun's year, which is why calendars from Babylon to Rome to the Vineyard tablet keep reaching for 12 months and patching the remainder. The sun's own road through the stars, the road the planets and moon also keep to, was divided by the old astronomers into 12 houses, the 12 the Geneva specimen wears in silver. Noon and midnight each stood 12 hours from the other in the Roman day. 12 was not a number among numbers. It was the sky's signature, the count you arrived at whenever you asked the heavens how they were organised, and the ancients asked constantly, and the answer kept coming back 12, and they noticed. And here is where I finally set the two things side by side and leave them touching, as the deep theories do. On the one hand, a people for whom the turning 12-fold sky was calendar, compass, Scripture, and the steadiest presence in every life from cradle to grave. On the other hand, the one solid shape in all of geometry, one of only 5 perfect forms the universe permits, and the rarest and most wonderful of them, that presents to the world exactly 12 identical faces, the shape their own philosophers had already crowned, in writing, as the form of the heavens themselves. If those two hands never met, if the sky-keeping people of the Roman North spent 3 centuries lavishing their finest bronze craft on the sky's own shape by pure coincidence, then it is a coincidence of a size that I personally cannot get comfortable on, and I have tried, and I sleep well on almost anything. That is not proof. You know by now that nothing tonight is proof. Every whole diameter that refuses to repeat is the evidence politely reminding us that we are guessing. But there are guesses that fight the whole grain of the evidence, and guesses that lie down along it, and as you lie there yourself, warm in the dark, with the great wheel turning unseen above your ceiling exactly as it turned above the hill by the Rhine, you can feel the difference. And feeling the difference, at this hour, is enough. The first of the sky theories, then, and it begins of all places in a farmer's field in autumn, with a question every soul in the ancient North asked every year of their lives, and no almanac could answer. When do we sow? The gentlest of the sky theories comes from a Dutch researcher who spent years measuring the angles of the holes. And it goes like this. Suppose you are a farmer in Gaul, and your livelihood hangs on one date above all others, the right day to sow the winter grain. Too early and it rots, too late and the frost takes it. And the almanac cannot simply say a date, because the calendar of the sky drifts against the calendar of men. What you need is the sun itself to tell you, and the sun will tell you, if you know how to ask, because the height of its arc changes day by day through the autumn. The theory proposes that the dodecahedron is the asking device. Hold it up at the right moment, let the sunlight pass through one particular pair of opposed holes, and the angles built into the object act like a little bronze question put to the sky, and on the day the light threads the needle just so. The sun has sunk to the sowing angle, and the fields are ready. It would explain the north-only map. The argument runs, because the farther north you live, the less the Mediterranean farming calendar fits your sky, and Italy, which never needed the correction, never needed the object. I find this theory beautiful, and I want to be fair to it, and fairness requires the usual cold water. The holes, measured across the whole population of specimens, do not repeat as a sun reckoner's holes would need to. Each object asking the sky a private question in a private dialect, and an instrument that gives every farm a different sowing day, is back to being an argument rather than a tool. The measurements have not convinced the discipline, but notice something even in the failing, because it is the first theory tonight that does not die of the wear problem. An object lifted to the sun a few mornings a year, then wrapped and shelved, would come down the centuries to us exactly as these do come down, crisp and unworn and cherished. Whatever the truth of the sunlight, the rhythm of that life, the mostly resting, sometimes raised rhythm, fits the evidence better than any hammer, gauge or knitting form ever did. Hold on to the rhythm and let the mechanism go, and now let me show you the 2 specimens I promised. The ones that keep every sky theory breathing, no matter how many measurements fail. In Geneva, in Switzerland, there is a dodecahedron unlike all the others. It is small, and it is not hollow bronze but a core of lead, and it was clad in plates of silver, and on its 12 faces, where every other specimen in Europe keeps a blank silence, there are words. 12 of them, engraved in Latin letters, one to a face. And the words are the zodiac, the bull, the twins, the crab, the lion, the whole wheel of the constellations that the sun walks through in a year, one sign for each of the 12 faces of the one solid that Plato said the god used for the heavens. There it is, at last, an ancient voice speaking directly from the surface of a dodecahedron, and what it says, the only thing any of them has ever said, is sky. 12 faces, 12 signs, the shape of the heavens, labelled with the contents of the heavens. Now the honest footnotes, because we keep our bargains here. The Geneva specimen is late, from around the era when the empire in the West was guttering, and it is materially so different from the classic bronze cages that some scholars set it apart entirely, a cousin rather than a sister. Perhaps an astrologer's die or a fortune-teller's piece for casting horoscopes. It cannot, alone, unlock the 130 silent ones. But it proves something that no amount of skepticism can take back. It proves that at least some people in the late Roman world, when they held a 12-faced solid in their hands, were thinking about the circle of the heavens, because one of them wrote it down, in silver, 12 times. And the icosahedron of Arloff, the 20-sided cousin mislabeled in its drawer for a century, whispers the same thing from the other direction. Because a workshop tradition that renders more than one of Plato's perfect solids is a tradition that knows the set, and the set was never a toolbox. The 5 perfect solids came down the centuries wrapped in exactly one tradition, the philosophical one: fire, earth, air, water, and heaven, the alphabet of the cosmos. Which brings us to divination, the most widespread serious theory in the scholarship today, and the one I want you to fall asleep weighing, because it fits the evidence with an ease that is almost suspicious. The peoples of the ancient world, all of them, Roman and Celt alike, asked their futures of objects. They cast lots, they drew marked staves, they read the fall of dice dedicated in temples. And archaeology finds their fortune telling gear from Britain to the Black Sea. Suppose the dodecahedron belongs to that family. A diviner's instrument, rolled or spun or reed, its 12 faces perhaps standing for the 12 signs, or 12 months or 12 gods, its differing holes and knobs meaningful to the reader in ways that died with the last reader. At one stroke, everything difficult becomes easy. The preciousness is explained, sacred instruments are made of the best, think of chalices. The lack of standardization is explained. A diviner's kit is personal, powerful because it is yours, its measurements answerable to no legion's inspector. The gentle, unworn lives are explained, wrapped in cloth, kept on the shelf of a shrine, touched on the days that mattered. The graves and rivers and careful pits are explained, because sacred things are not thrown away, they are given away, to the water or the ground or the dead. Even the great silence is explained, and this is the part I find most quietly persuasive, because divination in the Roman provinces lived exactly in the world that writing never reached. The state religion wrote itself down endlessly, but the wise woman at the edge of the village, the lot caster at the shrine of a river god, the whole vast folk religious life of the countryside, that world passed its knowledge mouth to mouth for 1,000 years, and left us almost nothing but its objects, found in exactly the places we find our dodecahedra. It cannot be proven. Let me say that plainly, and let the word rest a moment, because after 50 theories the temptation to crown the survivor is strong, and the discipline of this whole night has been to resist crowning anyone. No text confirms it. No excavation has yet caught a dodecahedron in the act, laid out on a diviner's cloth with its companion pieces. The theory wins by fitting, not by proof, and things can fit and still be false. The knitting theory taught us that within living memory. But when the specialists are polled these days, when the museum labels hazard their careful sentence, possibly religious or magical, this is the current running under the words. 300 years of trying to make the object into a tool have failed. The tide of the argument has turned toward meaning, and toward the sky, and toward the quiet possibility that we have spent 3 centuries asking a ritual object for its job description. Which is, when you think about it, precisely the kind of question one civilization always asks about another civilization's holy things. And precisely the kind that never gets an answer. There remains one piece of evidence we have not yet dared to open, the most intimate of all. I have mentioned it twice and stepped back twice, because it deserves the deepest hour of the night, and we have reached that hour now. It is a grave, and what was in it, and who was in it, and where the dodecahedron lay when the excavators found it, is the closest thing this whole mystery has to a moment when the ancient world almost tells us the truth. Beside the Rhine, downstream from the fort where we stood with Aelianus, there is a place where the dead of the frontier were laid for 500 years. One of the largest ancient cemeteries ever excavated in Europe. Thousands upon thousands of graves. Roman and Frankish, soldier and farm wife, pagan and Christian, generation under generation in the river gravel near Krefeld. The diggers worked there for decades, numbering the graves in the thousands, and in one of them, a burial of the late Roman years, they found a dodecahedron. Only a handful have ever been found in graves at all, so each one is precious, but this one carried a detail that has haunted the literature ever since. By the account that has come down through the excavation reports, the object did not lie among the vessels and dress fittings as one more possession. It lay by the body in association with the remains of a slender rod, a staff, as if the bronze cage had been mounted upon it, or meant to be, the way an orb crowns a sceptre. And the body, as the bones were red, was a woman. I want to be careful here, as we have been all night. Old excavations are read at a distance, bones and reports can be reread, and a single grave is a single grave. But allow the scene for a moment on its own reported terms, because archaeology is at bottom the discipline of last scenes, and this one rewards the imagining. Somebody died, a woman, in a river town on the crumbling frontier of the Roman world, and when her people gathered to send her into the ground, among everything she owned, what they chose to lay with her body, for whatever waited beyond it, was a staff crowned with a 12-faced bronze form pierced with holes. Nobody does that casually. Grave goods are the most deliberate objects in all of archaeology, chosen under the pressure of grief. Each one an argument about who the dead person was. A soldier gets his belt. A child gets her doll. A magistrate gets his seal. What kind of person gets a staff crowned with the shape of the heavens? Let us give her a name, knowing we are inventing it, as we gave names to the smith and the soldier, because namelessness keeps the past at arm's length, and I want, just for this hour. To close the distance, call her Severina. Suppose her house stood at the edge of the settlement, nearest the water. Suppose that when a cow sickened, or a husband's ship was late, or a fever walked the lanes, it was Severina's door the town knocked at after the temple's official answers ran out. Suppose that on certain mornings, certain hinge days of the turning year, she would take down from its shelf a wrapped thing that her mother had kept before her, and unwind the cloth, and hold up to the pale northern sky a small cage of bronze with 12 mouths, and that what she did next, the words, the turning, the reading of light or lot, was hers alone, learned by firelight, never written, because writing was for tax collectors and the sky could not be taxed. Suppose that is roughly, even distantly, the kind of life that ended in that grave by the Rhine. Then everything we have gathered tonight settles into place with a soft click, not as proof, never as proof, but as a story with no leftover pieces, and after 50 theories, no leftover pieces is as close to morning as this mystery has ever come. The map fits, for such wisdom belonged to the Celtic North, and would have meant nothing in Naples. The preciousness fits, for a community pays for its holy instruments as it pays for nothing else. The variation fits, for power of this kind is personal, and no two practitioners' instruments need agree. Indeed, perhaps they must not. The gentleness fits, the crisp unworn knobs, the lives spent wrapped in cloth between the days that mattered. The hoards fit, for when the raiders came, you buried the money because it was your future, and the dodecahedron because it was your protection, and the rivers fit, and the careful pit at Norton Disney fits, sacred things given, not thrown, to the water and the ground. Even the silence fits, twice over, once because oral knowledge dies with its keepers, and once because Rome's writers catalogued the religions of the provinces only when they frightened or amused them, and a village seeress with a bronze star shape on a staff did neither. She was beneath the notice of literature, and so she slipped past it, holding the one secret the Empire's paperwork never caught. I should, in fairness, set one more candidate on the table before we let the night have us, because it is the humblest of the deep theories and some fine scholars favour it. Perhaps the dodecahedron had no fixed purpose at all, not even a sacred one, and was simply the masterpiece, in the old guild sense, the showpiece a bronzer smith cast to prove he had fully learned his art, geometry, coring. One poor casting, finishing, all demonstrated in a single impossible-looking object, made to sit on the workshop shelf and say silently to every customer, "The hands here can do anything." It would explain the variation, every master his own design, and the wonderful craft, and even the pride with which the things were kept. I do not quite believe it, only because the map argues back. Masterpieces should appear wherever there were bronzy smiths, which is everywhere, not only in the Celtic north, and masterpieces do not usually follow their makers into graves and riverbeds. But hold it as a reminder that the honest list of possibilities is always longer than the beloved one. And now, at last, the payoff I asked you to keep in your pocket at the very start of the night, in the candlelit room in London. Plato, writing in Greek, 400 years before the first legionary ever waded ashore in Britain, taking the 5 perfect solids one by one and dealing them out to the elements like cards, the pyramid to fire, the cube to earth, the octahedron to air, the icosahedron to water, and then the 5th card, the 12-sided one, the one left over when the elements were spent, and Plato pauses and writes one enormous, improbable sentence. There remained one construction, the 5th, and the god used it for the universe, embroidering figures upon it. The heavens embroidered with figures, the constellations stitched onto a dodecahedron. Now stand in the museum in Geneva and look at the little silver-clad specimen with the 12 signs of the zodiac lettered on its 12 faces, the heavens embroidered with figures, in a provincial workshop's actual silver, and tell me the old philosopher's sentence and the frontier's strange object never met. Somewhere between the lecture halls of the Mediterranean and the hearth law of the Celtic North, the idea of a shape that holds the sky found a people who already believed the sky could be held, and they did what humans have always done with the shapes of their deepest ideas. They made them. In the best material they had, with the best hands they had, over and over, for 200 years. A universe for the shelf, a universe for the staff, a universe for the grave, no two alike because no two lives are. That is not a fact. Let me be perfectly clear as the night grows thin. That is a story, my story, the one investigator's best account after all the evidence has been walked. And tomorrow a trench in some Belgian field could hand up one dodecahedron with a price scratched on it, or a use-worn socket, and the whole cathedral of the idea would come politely down. That is the deal in this trade, and it is a good deal. But if you ask me at this hour, with the lamps low, what I actually think the thing is, I will tell you what I think 130 times over, from Hertfordshire to Hungary. I think it is the sky, held in the hand, and I think the people who made it would be neither surprised nor sorry that we cannot prove it. Because the whole point of the sky to them was that it could be known and honoured and asked, but never ever owned. And so we come down to the last hour, the one where the story stops moving forward and simply settles, like sediment in still water, and I want to spend it back, where we began, in London, but 287 years later, after closing time, in the long gallery where one of these objects lives now. I have stood there at the end of the day, when the school groups are gone and the lights are stepping down and the room does that thing museums do at dusk, when all the objects seem to move 1 inch closer together. The dodecahedron sits on its little glass shelf, lit from above, green as a pond in June. The label beside it is 4 lines long. It gives the material, the century, the place of finding, and then the sentence that has drawn people across the room for generations. Function unknown. Function unknown. Every other treasure in that gallery has been captured, catalogued, explained, tamed. The coins confess their emperors. The tombstones confess their grief. Even the curse tablets, scratched with the angriest secrets of the ancient heart, have been read and translated and published. Only the little bronze cage sits there, in the empire of explanation, still free. We have walked a long way around it tonight, you and I. We watched it rise out of a Hertfordshire field into candlelight, and we drew the map together. The lamps burning across the Celtic north and the great darkness over Italy. We stood in the heat of the workshop while a week of skill and a fortune in bronze took the shape the wax surrendered. We knelt at the pit in Lincolnshire with the volunteers on the best morning of their lives. We ran the tray of theories through the 4 quiet tests, where, standard, context, text, and watched the candlestick and the gauge and the die and the rangefinder and the knitting form each carry one corner of the truth and drop the other 3. We stood the freezing watch on the Rhine and read about the socks and the underpants and learned how loud a silence can be in a civilization that wrote everything down. And we ended in the deep hours among the sky theories, with the silver cousin in Geneva wearing the zodiac on its 12 faces, and Plato's audacious old sentence about the 5th shape, the one the god used for the whole, and the grave by the great cemetery on the Rhine where a woman went into the ground holding a staff crowned with the heavens. I told you at the start that we would not solve it, and we have kept that promise as faithfully as the object has kept its own. But I do not think we leave empty-handed, and I do not mean the theories. I mean the thing underneath the theories. The thing I find myself carrying out of that museum gallery every time, past the guards, into the evening. It is this. We are told more or less constantly now that everything is knowable, that every question is a search away, and we have built our whole waking lives on that promise, and the promise is mostly kept, and somehow the keeping of it has not made us calm. And then you stand in front of 11 centimetres of ancient bronze that 130 times over, across 3 centuries of digging and measuring and arguing by the finest minds of 15 generations, has said, gently no. And what you feel, if you are honest, is not frustration. It is relief. Somewhere in the world there is still a locked room. Somewhere the past is still keeping something back, the way a grandmother keeps one recipe unwritten. And knowing that, you can finally stop gripping. The past does not keep its secrets from us, I have come to believe. It keeps them for us. So that there is always one more reason to kneel in a Lincolnshire field in June. So that a child in a museum can stand in front of one label in the whole building and be told, truthfully nobody knows, maybe you will be the one. So that the rest of us, at the end of a loud day, can lie in the dark beside a 1700-year-old question and feel, in its company, not smaller, but quieter. If tonight's journey brought you that quiet, even a few minutes of it, then stay with me here on this channel, because this is what we do in these long episodes, one impossible object at a time, unhurried, every week. And there are so many more waiting on the shelf, and if you subscribe you will not lose your place by the lamp. And before you drift the rest of the way down, leave me 2 things in the comments. If your eyes can manage it, and if not, tomorrow will do beautifully. First, tell me where in the world you are listening from, because half the pleasure of this quiet room we share is seeing the map of it. The lamps coming on across the dark quilt, a lamp in Manila, a lamp in Ohio, a lamp in Nairobi. Our own curious distribution for some patient soul to puzzle over in 1700 years. And second, tell me where you finally landed tonight, because there are really only 2 beds to sleep in at the end of this story, and I have made them both up for you. Perhaps you are a tool person, and you believe the answer is practical, waiting in some unexcavated workshop, an honest instrument whose manual simply rotted, and one day a trench will vindicate you. Or perhaps you are a talisman person, and you believe the object was never for the hands at all, but for the heavens, a held piece of the sky, and the silence around it was reverence, not oversight. Tool or talisman. Write me the one word you believe, and read the other's words, and notice, as you scroll, that after 287 years the room is still, wonderfully, divided. Next week, if you will join me, we are going somewhere even stranger and much older. Long before Rome, before the pyramids themselves were more than a plan in a dead king's eye. The people of what is now Scotland began carving small stone spheres, hundreds of them, worked with astonishing geometric precision into knobs and spirals and perfect symmetries, and then, as far as anyone can tell, they carried them for 1,000 years and never once told the neighbours what they were. 5,000 years old, and the label beside them says exactly what tonight's label said. Function unknown. It is one of my favourite mysteries on this whole round earth, and I have been saving it for you. But that is next week. For now, the museum is closed. The guards have finished their rounds. In the long gallery, the lights are down to their nighttime blue, and on its glass shelf the little bronze cage sits in the hush it has earned, 12 faces, 20 small knobs. A dozen holes opening onto darkness, and through the high window above it, very slowly, the moonlight crosses the floor, reaches the case, and rests there a while, the oldest light we have, lying quietly against the oldest question, and neither of them needing, tonight or any night, to say one word more. Sleep well.